I'm Scott Weichel. You're listening to My Kind of Country. Thanks for joining me on a Monday night. Very pleased to welcome Dix Bruce to the show tonight. Dix is the gentleman who recorded Tiny Moore back in 1980, an unreleased recording that he made, and it has never been heard until now. AcousticDisc.com has just released this historic recording, and of course, Tiny Moore was a longtime member of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, and also Merle Haggard's Strangers. So Dix is here tonight to talk about this great project, and we're going to play a bunch of the songs for you. And again, the download for this is available at AcousticDisc.com. It's a pleasure to welcome Dix Bruce to My Kind of Country. Dix, how are you tonight?
I am doing good. I hope you're doing good, too.
Doing fantastic. Nice to have you. And we had a chance to get acquainted a little bit before the interview and discovered that we were both born in Traverse City, Michigan. That's pretty cool.
That's right. But I think I'm a little older than you are, and probably it was in those days. It was just a very small little 2-room hospital.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Small world. So how in the world did you end up clear out in California?
Well, I lived in Bear Lake, Michigan, which is a little bit, I guess it's a little bit north of Manistee, which is maybe a slightly bigger town, and lived there for the first about 10 years of my life, and then the family moved to southern Wisconsin, and I went to school and college there and got interested in music there, and a friend of mine from college suggested that I go out to the San Francisco Bay Area right after college to be a camp counselor. And I thought, oh, this will be great. I'd love to see California. And I liked it and stayed. So that's kind of it.
So tell me how you first came into contact with Tiny Moore.
So I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that's just, there's San Francisco, and then there's all the towns like Oakland and Marin County and Richmond, and then further out, Concord, where I live now. You always heard about Tiny, and he was always, talked about in hushed tones. So this guy actually lives in Sacramento, which is about, I guess, an hour and a half away, on a good traffic day anyway. And it was one of those things that young musicians just thought about. And a lot of them actually went up and took lessons from Tiny. He had a music store called Tiny Moore Music. I sort of knew about him from the Bob Wills recordings that, Bob Wills would always identify the players. He'd go, Tiny Moore, biggest little instrument in the world. On that electric mandolin, Tiny Moore. So at the time, I was just really wanting to be a musician, and I was very intrigued by them. And, my view of somebody like Tiny Moore was he was this big star and this great player. And I didn't go see Tiny. I was kind of intimidated by his reputation. And when I met him, he was incredibly friendly and wonderful and sharing and supportive and a great guy. I finally ran into him. I used to go to these fiddle contests, regional fiddle contests. Mm-hmm. And they used to have, at the time I was mostly playing guitar, they would have flat picking contests. So I went for that, and I always would go for the jamming because people would constantly be jamming. It was a great thing. And I was in the contest, I think it was in Redding, California, and I actually won. And I was in my early 20s at the time, and an older guy came over to me, and he said, we really like that song you guys played, that you played in the contest. And I said, which one? So, that one that was kind of minor key. And I said, I kind of took a chance on that. That's a David Grisman song. And I didn't know if I would be penalized for not playing totally. Oh, no, that's good stuff. And I'm here with a bunch of older guys, and I'm here with Tiny Moore, and he liked it. I said, you're here with Tiny Moore's here? He says, oh, yeah. Wow, I can't believe it. Would you like to meet him? I said, yeah, I would love to meet him. So he brought Tiny over, and Tiny was anything but Tiny. He towered over me, and he was real nice and complimentary. And I said, gosh, I want to know this guy more. So I kind of blurted out, could I come and interview you for Mandolin World News? And he kind of laughed and said, you want a what now? I remember he said it like that. You want a what now? I said, well, David Grisman has this magazine, and I'd like to interview you for it. Now, I should say right now I had no connection with the magazine. I just knew about it, and I read it. But I thought, oh, here's my chance. Tiny said, well, I guess so. You know, could you come up and to my store in Sacramento? Absolutely. He gave me his card and said, give me a call, and we'll set something up. And I was just on cloud nine. I thought, this is going to be great. Anyway, on the way back down from Reading, I was with a couple of my friends, and I started to think, I said, oh, gee, what if... I didn't know David Grisman at the time. What if he doesn't like this idea? I knew Darrell Anger, who was the violinist in the David Grisman Quintet, and he was the guy, he was a friend of mine, and I would talk to him, and I called him up the next morning. I said, gee, Darrell, I hope I didn't goof this up, but I said that I would like to interview Tiny. He said, oh, you met Tiny Moore? I said, yeah. He said, can I come along on the interview? So I knew I was okay. And we went up to Sacramento in a couple of weeks, and the two or three of us, was me and Darrell and another good friend of mine named Bob Alekno, great mandolin player. And I interviewed Tiny, sort of got to know him to the point where, I would call him once in a while and say, are you playing anywhere in the area? Or he would let me know about stuff. I learned so much from him just talking with him in this interview, and the attitudes that he had toward playing, and just really turned my head around. Specifically, one thing I remember is I think I'd asked him about, how do you teach people to play jazz songs? And my background to that is that songs like, Duke Ellington songs don't get around much anymore. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, or, Honeysuckle Rose or Sweet Georgia Brown. I thought of them as jazz songs. And I remember Tiny said, now what do you mean jazz songs? And I mentioned those names, and he said, well, I think of those as pop songs. And the concept here was, I was looking at this repertoire as jazz. He was looking at the act of improvisation as jazz. And that, now it makes perfect sense to me. But in those days, it was just like an incredibly big idea that, and to him, I always heard these songs in jazz contexts of jazz bands and jazz musicians playing these songs. And he called them pop songs because they were on the radio when he was a kid. And they were played by big bands and small bands. And that was the material that he learned in order to play music in public. That's what people wanted to hear. So that was my whole association with Tiny. There was those kind of things that blew me away. And it may have been just that I was so young and naive that these things had not occurred to me. But he was the guy that really brought those things down to earth for me. And just his, I think one of the things I've always enjoyed interviewing other musicians, just to see how they relate to music and how they live life and how they put it all together. Tiny was a major influence for that. So that's how I got to know him. And so the California State Fair is in Sacramento, which is the state capital. Mm-hmm. And it's this, I don't know if it is anymore, but it used to be this huge deal at a huge fairgrounds and lots of entertainment. And Tiny actually contracted and ran a stage for the run of the fair, which is at least 2 weeks. And so he would have, starting in the afternoon, bands that would play all the way to midnight. And he would hire my band, and he just was really a nice guy and encouraging, and that's the story.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, you have just released a previously unreleased recording that Tiny did in 1980. And folks, you can go to acousticdisc.com and get a copy of this. It's called Tiny Moore Live, recorded at Larry Blake's. Tell me the story. You recorded this, right, Dix? It was something you recorded at the time and then kind of sat on a shelf for many years. Tell me the story of how this whole thing came to be.
Okay. Well, Tiny had called me up, or I'd called him, and he played in the area usually with pretty country-tinged bands. So this is, Tiny must have been in his late 50s then, and he was really dedicated to playing the fiddle in a contest setting. And he had started out as a violinist, and then I think he heard this electric mandolin player, Leo Rayleigh, on the radio and said, that's the sound I want. And in the Wills band, he played both fiddle and electric mandolin, or I should say electrified acoustic mandolin. So he told me about a gig that he was going to play in Berkeley, California, at this club that was a subterranean club called Larry Blake's. And the interesting thing was that he was going to do it with more of a modern jazz band. And I knew of these players because you'd hear on the radio, you know, Dick Whittington will be playing here, or Rob Fisher will be playing here, or Vince Latiano on drums will be playing with these guys. These guys were all pretty famous touring musicians, but would play locally. And this was odd. I'd never heard Tiny in this context. I was really excited about it. It was going to be in late December of that year, 1980. I had just gotten a reel-to-reel 4-track recorder. It was a big, heavy Akai machine, and I really wanted to try it out. And I just said, kind of blurted out again, Tiny, could I come and record it? I just got this new tape recorder, and I'm learning how to use it. And I remember again, he kind of laughed as if to say, well, why would you want to do that? But sure, come on down. So a friend of mine and I hauled all this equipment downstairs into the Larry Blake subterranean basement, and this stuff was really heavy. It still is really heavy. We set it up, and I had gotten a little mixer with it so that I could put the microphones into the mixer and route them into the machine, and we had headphones, and the band started to play, and we were adjusting things during this first set, and the music was really incredible. Again, another one of those Tiny Moore moments where I just was blown away by the way these guys played. And one of the most interesting things about it is that they hadn't rehearsed. They just, Tiny would say, Georgia on my mind in F, okay? And everybody would go, yeah, okay. 1, 2. And he'd play it in, and they would trade around solos, and the bass player soloed, and the piano player soloed, and the bass player and the drummer soloed, and it was just wonderful music. So I had this recording. We enjoyed it at the time. I got the thing home, and I listened to it, and I just said, "Oh, this stuff is incredible!" And since the time I'd interviewed him, I had started working for Mandolin World News. I was the editor, and I got to know David Grisman and the other guys in his band, and a lot of them, they all kind of contributed stuff to the magazine. So I made a cassette tape for David and, Daryl and those other guys, and everybody agreed that it was phenomenal music. And the repertoire was, I think in the whole night, Tiny only did one song, which was Take Me Back to Tulsa, that would be associated with his Bob Wills Western Swing. It was all jazz on standards, like Georgia on My Mind, or It Had to Be You, or whatever. And Tiny was really an amazing performer. He was totally calm and said just the right stuff and enough stuff. He said very little during the show. It's just constant music. And I should mention that Tiny, in addition to having been in Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys and in Merle Haggard's Strangers and all this stuff, he was always in bands, but he had been on the television in Sacramento, and he had a kids show, and I think he was called Ranger Roy. And so he was really experienced with thinking on his feet and keeping it moving and keeping things within time frames. And I'll start this out, then we'll do a piano solo. I'll take the bridge on the fiddle, and he'd pick up the fiddle and, play his solo. The last 8 of the chorus, then the piano player would take it, and he stage managed this so beautifully, and I think it might have been certainly cumulative, but it had a lot to do with his TV experience.
So the question is, what took so long? And how did this all finally happen for you?
I didn't have any idea how you would do that. I knew you would have to get permission. And of course, I gave Tiny copies of this too, and I'm sure he gave some copies of the copy. But I would need a record company. The record company would have to license the songs and license the performances from all the guys, and I just couldn't think of any way to do it myself. In those days, you really didn't do stuff like that yourself, and I didn't really send it around because I kind of didn't feel like I owned it, in a way, that it wasn't up to me. And I also thought that, well, maybe, if Tiny wants to do it, he'll do it, and I'd be happy to, give him the tapes. I think what happened, I may have mentioned this to you, is that I have given this to students over the years that I've had. And had this student, and I made him a CD of it. I guess it was within the last year or two. And he was blown away by it. Great student. And he came for the next lesson, which was, it might have been on Zoom because I think the pandemic may have happened. And that figures in this whole story, too. And he kind of gently said to me, well, what's going to happen to this stuff? There's nothing like this on the internet. I searched. And what's going to happen to this stuff? And I realized what he was saying was, when you croak, what happens to this stuff? And it hit me after the lesson, and I just kind of went, oh, yeah, here's these tapes, the reel-to-reel tapes. I still have the player, but when I'm gone, these would just be like, well, what are these things? What should we do with them? And on top of that, the last time I played the tapes, they had developed this thing called sticky shed syndrome, which happened to analog tapes after a certain point in the late 70s, early 80s, where supposedly the formulation of the emulsion on the tapes was changed. What happened is the emulsion would come off and gum off your tape recorder heads, and you could play about a minute, and you'd start hearing this terrible squealing through the headphones or whatever you have it plugged into, and in the room. It was just awful. And luckily, there's a pretty good remedy to it, and that is you have to take the tapes and bake them for, say, 6 hours at 140 degrees. And so I cooked the tapes, and they played beautifully. Now, what I'm thinking of is if you didn't know that and you found some old tapes in a box and you tried to play them, assuming you found a machine, and they started squealing like that, you'd say, oh, these are up into the dumpster. So anyway, I thought about all this, and I got inspired, and I said, I really should check those tapes again and, see what's up with them. And I listened again and was blown away, and I thought, well, maybe I should send this to David Grisman. And the worst he'll do is say no, and, maybe he'll just ignore it because he's busy and doing a lot of stuff. And he has acoustic disc. So I sent him the stuff, and I got home one day, and there was an answering machine message, and it was, hey, man, I don't want to buy any books or anything, but I want to talk to you about this Tiny Moore recording. I think we can do something with it. And oh, great. So I got in touch with David, and we did that, and he did some incredible things sonically with it to make it sounded pretty darn good, and put the thing out after all these years. And people are, I've gotten some feedback from people like you that listen to him and, again, just never realized that Tiny did this kind of music and how well he did it. It's just a great addition, I think, that the world can hear this stuff now.
Well, there's an album, too, that Tiny had to have been recorded about the same time that your live thing was done. He recorded a studio album called Tiny Moore Music, and
right.
Had Merle Haggard playing on it and a bunch of different musicians. And they did some really cool jazz stuff, Fat Boy Rag, and some really cool stuff on there, too. So this was really interesting to be able to hear him in a live setting to do some of that kind of stuff. And I also wanted to ask, this is the entire set that night. You recorded, 28 songs, right?
Yes, it was, like 3.5 sets. And the only thing that we didn't put out was they started by just playing a blues. And I didn't get the machine turned on in time. And that was the first song where everything was mono, and we were tweaking the dials and trying to get it was incomplete, David thought, well, we probably should leave this off. So there may be someday when we do a special reissue.
There you go.
But yes, it was a whole show, and just as we put it in as sets the way it was done, and pretty much what happened that night.
Well, folks, you can go to acousticdisc.com. We will put that information on our Facebook page. And Dix, I want to thank you not only, again, for preserving this historic recording and getting it out there again along with David Grisman, but thank you for taking time to share this on the show today. And we're going to play a whole bunch of these songs for our listeners right now.
Well, I sure appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
All right. That's Dix Bruce here on My Kind of Country. Here's some fabulous music from the great Tiny Moore as we continue with My Kind of Country and Tiny Moore live at Larry Blake's.
Joe Griffith.